Dear colleagues who watch this video, it's a very special pleasure, and it's not a diplomatic nicety this time. It's a very special pleasure to welcome as our guest Lord Robertson of Port Ellen. I call him George, but I think he deserves a good proper introduction, as he is not only Lord of Port Ellen, but also former Secretary General of NATO. And what I want him, ask him, and agreed with him to talk about is what it means to be in this impossible job of the Secretary General of NATO. What is the how do you perform? What do you do as Secretary General? So, George, if you agree, I would give you the floor and ask you to talk about it. I think it will be very useful for our participants.
Thank you very much, István, and it's nice to be, even if only virtually, in your company again. We had some good times before. Describing the job of Secretary General of NATO is not an easy one, because there is no job description. When I was appointed by 19 heads of state and government in 1999 to be Secretary General, I didn't get a pack of papers describing the job, telling me precisely what I had to do, who I reported to, and the rest of it, because NATO is an organization made up of nation states. It has a very small secretariat, the international staff that you used to be yourself part of, in a headquarters, at that time a very ancient, almost unhealthy building in Brussels, but a campus with maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people on it, but very few of them responsible to the Secretary General. So the Secretary General, it traditionally is a non-American, is traditionally a politician. We've had foreign ministers, defense ministers, and prime ministers. The present one is a prime minister. And the job of the Secretary General essentially is to supervise over the international staff, to chair the meetings of the council, to basically keep the whole show on the road, and to provide the political leadership for an alliance of now 30 nations, all joined together in a common defense. So the Secretary General is on one hand a politician, a chief executive, a diplomat, a manipulator, an international statesman, but at the same time a human being as well, and somebody who has to lead a number of nations, 19 in my time and now 30, in a joint endeavour to protect those countries themselves. So I don't know whether that answers the question for you. I had to find my own way. I had a dinner beforehand with my predecessor, Javier Solana, who had been the foreign minister of Spain, and had actually in his past campaigned against NATO membership. We sat round a dining table and he told me what he'd done. He told me about the things he hadn't done, and he told me about the things that I would be expected to do that he had not been able to do in a very crowded, eventful, and very successful 4-year term of office that he had had. He went on to become High Representative for Foreign Policy in the European Union, so he was still regularly coming to NATO headquarters. So I had the advantage of having his advice on a regular basis, should I have required it. But that one very brief dinner that I had was probably the only real preparation that was available to me, because I stopped being a British politician when I was appointed to NATO and became a creature and an employee of NATO responsible to the 19 countries and no longer to my own native country. In fact, the ambassador of the United Kingdom at the time made it perfectly clear that in order to show that I was independent, then he was going to stand back and not offer the kind of advice that he used to give me as a minister.
Sounds interesting. You were Secretary General in a very interesting times of the history of NATO, right? So, what is the Secretary General doing when you hear that there is a crisis or a conflict unfolding? What's your reaction? How do you act?
Well, you act in many ways instinctively. You have been appointed because you were a senior politician. I'd been in politics since the age of 15 and was appointed, I think, at the age of 54 to be Secretary General of NATO. So, your instincts are quite sharp. And I, of course, had been Minister of Defence in the preceding 2 years, which had encompassed a variety of conflicts, including, of course, the Kosovo War. So when you come up against a crisis, your instincts, are quite sharp and alive. If I could illustrate it then with the situation that applied on the 11th of September 2001, 9/11, the attack by Al-Qaeda on the United States of America and the civil airliners which crashed into the Twin Towers of New York and the plane that crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. Now, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is the foundation of NATO. It says that an attack on one country in the alliance will be taken as an attack on all countries in the alliance. And that was originally designed to deal with the threat posed by Stalin against the original NATO countries. And the assumption was that if Russia attacked one of the smaller countries, then all of the countries, including the United States of America, would be involved in their defense. So, if a few days before 9/11, we'd had a simulation exercise like the one you're doing about a terrorist attack on New York, the people around the table, I think, would have come to the conclusion that it was not really the subject for Article 5. Article 5 was designed for a scenario where Stalin's or Russian Soviet troops would come across the North German plains as an invasion and trigger the defense of the alliance countries. And therefore, I think they would have concluded, no, that really, a terrorist attack was not really the subject for Article 5. But on the day when we were all shocked, many of your students would either be very young at that time or not alive at that time, but the sense of shock that went round the whole world at that moment meant that those of us in the headquarters of NATO felt, that something had to be done. One of the allies, one of the NATO countries, had been attacked from outside, and therefore it was appropriate to say an attack on the United States was an attack on all. So as Secretary General, I mobilized people at that time to say, right, we're going to invoke Article 5. And that will be a signal to America's enemies and indeed to America's friends that the alliance was alive and well and was responding to an attack that was taking place, designed in the Tora Bora mountains of Afghanistan, but actually delivered into the heart of one of the major cities of one of the NATO members. So, I was in the hot seat both making the suggestion about Article 5 and then delivering it with some difficulty, because getting 19 prime ministers and presidents to agree to something that big and that momentous required a lot of political guile, political intelligence, political instinct, which I had to use at that time. So that's an illustration of what the Secretary General can be asked to do at a moment of crisis.
I'm sure it was one of the most interesting moments of not only NATO's life, but your life too. But it was very successful. It did take only 24 hours to get the nations together. It is pretty fast, especially for an international institution.
Well, the thing about NATO is that it looks cumbersome with all of these countries, and sometimes, you know, they can be obstinate, they can be difficult. You know, you've got 19, in my case, 19 nations, 19 parliaments, 19 public opinions, 19 media setups, and therefore trying to bring them all together. Your people have said it's like herding cats, you know, or keeping frogs in a wheelbarrow, because, you know, you're dealing with, you know, with national interests all the time. So, you know, when it came to 9/11, when it came to the crisis in what is now North Macedonia, when it came to Afghanistan and NATO taking over responsibility for the international security and assistance force, ISAF, in Afghanistan, all of these were huge decisions for NATO to make, but it wasn't NATO, you know, like the European Union making it. It was NATO and all of its nations, public opinions, parliaments, all having to do it as well. So it required a balancing act, I have to say, in order to try and get the consensus. But having said that, you know, NATO operates on consensus, not by majority. Everyone has to agree on every single thing, and that makes life very difficult for the Secretary General. But once the consensus has been established, it can only be broken by consensus. So there has to be a unanimous decision to go back from a decision once it's been made. So whether it's declaring Article 5, the peace agreement 19 years ago in North Macedonia, or the decision to take on ISAF in Afghanistan, once these decisions were made, then it locked in NATO and all its constituent governments as well.
Well, I don't envy you. If I ever wanted to become Secretary General of NATO, I think after this I dropped this idea. It could be a good challenge, but I think it's something for much younger people, for as young as you were when you were doing this. I think that your presentation revealed a lot of interesting moments of how NATO works and how the Secretary General really works. So thank you very much for this, and I still hope to see you as soon as possible somewhere in the world, hopefully in Hungary, but if not in Hungary, then some other places is also okay. So thanks very much, and wish you all the best, and take care of you in the pandemic. It's even probably more dangerous than politics in the United Kingdom. So I really wish you all the best. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure to speak to you again, István. And the promise is still there. I will eventually get to Budapest, which is a city that I must say I really love, and I hope this simulation exercise is interesting and fascinating, as indeed my career was in NATO at the time.
Thank you very much. Thanks, and have a good day then. Thanks.